Wang Fanzhi, Untitled. I watch from afar the people of the world in villages and peaceful towns. When a family has a death in the house, the whole town comes to weep. With open mouths, they bewail the corpse, not understanding that bodies go fast. Actually, we're ghosts of the long sleep, come for a time to stand on the earth. It's almost like babies' diapers, at once dry, then wet in turn. The first to die is buried deep, the later ones are thrown in on top. So we continue with Buddhist poetry in the vernacular, and this is an example of a poem by Wang Fanzhi. Who is Wang Fanzhi? Well, let's start with this. Wang Fanzhi is a very similar figure to Han Shan. We're not sure that he actually really existed. There is a relatively wide corpus of Tang vernacular poetry that is attributed to him. First of all, the name is not a proper name, really. Wang is a name, but Fanxi means, well, I think it's the Chinese equivalent of the Sanskrit Brahmakarin, which designates a lay Buddhist zealot. So, for example, Wang Fanxi has been translated as in French as Wang le Zélateur. So this is a figure that is meant to be a lay Buddhist, but a lay Buddhist that is, very passionate about Buddhism. And this matches the content of the poems that have been ascribed to Wang Fanxi. They are generally pretty much about Buddhist topics. Stylistic analysis has shown that these poems were probably the work of different hands, probably from the 8th century. Actually, the poetry of Wang Fanxi has been preserved in 2 different collections. There's one, and most of those have appeared in Dunhuang, so they are in a way one of the very few glimpses we get at popular poetry during the Tang, not the typical scholarly official high literature poems that we get in most collections. So one of the collections, which does not include the poem I have just read, is basically a collection of quatrains. So they're very short, simple, didactic, gnomic poems. They are included in a collection of 92 poems. And, they're very, very conventional. They were probably just educational tools used by Buddhist monks when perhaps teaching children with them. And then there is another collection, which is a little bit more interesting, and the poem we've just read is the first one in such a collection that is called the Three Zhuang collection, which has been reconstructed from 7 manuscripts, but is not preserved. It hasn't been preserved intact. And it would have contained over 300 poems. So, centering in ourselves in this poem, so the topic is, a pretty morbid one and pretty macabre, which is the inevitability of death, which is a very common topic of poetry. It's a very common subject in both classical Chinese poetry, but also in Western poetry, Middle Ages poetry, for example. Well, I would say a universal topic in human poetry. And, scholar officials also treated this topic, but they did it in a different way, in a more indirect, refined and polished way. As I said, this poem is in the vernacular, and it's full of, according to some of the translators, it's in the original it would have been full of vigorous and colloquial language, immediate and simple, no allusions as you would typically expect in a classical Chinese poem, very strong didacticism. So we said the poem here, if you could reduce it to one topic, which you can, it's not a very complicated piece, it's just about death. Death will come to us all. We are transient beings living in the world. I don't think you could easily divide this poem into parts. Well, as usual, this is not, metrically speaking, it's not a regulated poem either. It has 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. It has 12 lines, but as usual, we can read them and consider as the basic unit the couplet. And as I said, you wouldn't be able to say that the poem has parts. Perhaps you could say like the first couplet introduces the topic, then the next, let's say, two couplets describe a specific scene or an imagined scene in a village when a death takes place. And then you could say the next three couplets are like a reflection back again on this topic of the ephemerality of human existence, and brought further to the foreground through a series of different images, of three different images of humans as ghosts, as humans as diapers, and on death just piling corpse upon corpse. Okay, then, so let's look at the poem couplet by couplet. First couplet. And I think there isn't any clear parallelism in the middle couplets, obviously. I watch from afar the people of the world in villages and peaceful towns. So the first couplet, as usual, and that doesn't have to do with regulated or unregulated, locates us. So we have a poetic persona who is unnamed, but we can imagine it to be a Buddhist layperson, like the author of the poem. He is contemplating, he is thinking about the world, and what is he thinking? Well, Buddhist thoughts. Although this does not clearly appear in the first couplet, we just get this observation of the world, of the rural world also, not of the urban world. So the people of the world in villages and peaceful towns. So only reading this couplet, you might imagine that you might be about to be exposed to some sort of Tao Chian-esque bucolic song about the pleasures of the simple life, but no. Second couplet. When a family has a death in the house, the whole town comes to weep. What the poetic persona is seeing in the village, in the peaceful village, is the break of the peace because of death. Even in Arcadia Ego, also in the villages, also in the peaceful towns, death comes for everybody. So death has come to a family, someone has died, the whole town comes to weep. That's the pain is shared by the village or the town. The third couplet continues, describing the scene. It makes it a little bit more visual. With open mouths, they bewail the corpse, not understanding that bodies go fast. So we're still in the scene of the second couplet. The poetic persona is looking at a death and is looking at the funeral arrangements, and the villagers crying, lamenting the passing away. But the second line of this couplet makes clear what the message that the poet wants to transmit is. They don't understand that bodies go fast. There is no point in lamenting death, because that is the way things are. Transience and death are the laws of human existence. And this is what's going to be developed in the next couplets. Fourth couplet, I think. Actually, we're ghosts of the long sleep, come for a time to stand on the earth. Now, this is probably the most interesting image in the poem. Like, usually one considers the normal state of a human being as being a human, and when one dies, one depending on your belief system, but one of the belief systems in China was you could become a ghost. So you had the normal life, and then you had this parenthetical and temporary, perhaps, condition of ghosthood. But here the tables are turned, like we are ghosts of the long sleep, come for a time to stand on the earth. The ghostliness, the unusualness is not what happens after death. The ghostliness, the unusualness is actually being alive. I mean, we are preceded by death, we are followed by death, and it's this ghostly, unnatural state of being alive, which is weird, sandwiched as it is between these periods of long sleep. Now, it's a curious image also because we said Wang Fanzhi is Buddhist, and this image of life as a ghostly, brief moment between two long sleeps. It feels a bit weird because Buddhists believe in reincarnation. This image would match better, in my opinion, a poetic persona who was not a Buddhist, who would believe, like some people in classical China believe that death was the end, the final end. But anyway, it's a beautiful image, an inversion, like the ghost state is being alive, it's not being dead. Next couplet, and again, the last two couplets in the translation I am reading, which is by Charles Hartman and Masha Kobzeva, and included in the Biographical Dictionary of Tang Dynasty Literati. The translation comes with the original, and it separates the last two couplets as if they were like an envoi or like the final couplet in a Spenserian or Shakespearean sonnet, which summarizes everything. But, I don't know, reading the translation, these last two couplets feel very similar to the one just before them. They summarize the message. Perhaps they abstract it more. So the message of the last two couplets again is, we are impermanent, and death follows upon death inexorably. So the next couplet, it's almost like baby's diapers, at once dry, then wet in turn. So, this is quite a clarificatory image. Like diapers were recycled, they were washed, they got wet, and then they were dried up. The image feels very classical Chinese. I can't imagine a typical Tang scholar official making reference to diapers in a poem. It feels really out of place in that sort of poetry. But of course, this is, as we said, this is colloquial poetry in colloquial language. So yeah, there it does make sense. It's a symbol. The scholar officials would probably have mentioned crickets dying in autumn and then coming again in spring, or flowers or something like that. But or dew would have been a better image. Yeah, dew just disappearing very quickly. Lying, setting down at night and disappearing in the morning. But yeah, diapers, yeah. And the last couplet, also the image is too distasteful, pointing at dead bodies being piled up. It's just this thing that most scholar officials would frown from including in a poem, except eccentrics, perhaps like Li He, or previous poems from before the Tang, or even from the Tang, depicting very, very violent and tragic scenes like ends of dynasties, destructions of cities, or battles. And even then, I think the language would be a little bit more indirect, or the images. The first to die is buried deep, the later ones are thrown in on top. So there's this image of, death just piling up, and, some rituals maybe for the older ones to die, for the first ones to die, but the others, death just keeps piling up, and the bodies are just thrown unceremoniously on a heap, which, is a very strong image. Remember, in China, especially for Confucians, funerals and the respect for burials is, really, really, really important. It's one of the greatest virtues of a good Confucian, that he will bury his or her parents in the most expensive, formal, and respectful way, with many coffins, good clothes, following the rituals, with a tumulus over the tomb, and so on. This is very important because it's a sign, a symbol of filial piety, which is one of the main virtues, and of respect for hierarchies, including the departed dead. So, yeah, a curious poem, this poem by Wang Fanzhi, and one similar to the Han Shan poems, perhaps very different from the others that we've been reading and talking about.